The summer of 1930 was not the summer of 1929. The air in New York City, heavy with August humidity and a mingled sense of coal smoke, cheap perfume, and hot asphalt, felt fundamentally different. Only 10 months earlier, the financial giddiness of the decade had crashed on the pavement of Wall Street. Yet the inertia of the roaring 20s, the sheer electric momentum of a decade spent living on borrowed time and bathtub gin, still spun the city in its orbit. Manhattan, an island carved by ambition and cemented by corruption, had entered the post-binge era. Before the crash, New York had been the undisputed capital of excess. It was the metropolis of the Jazz Age, where the rhythms of Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong poured out of speakeasy doors that looked like plain storefronts but led to velvet-draped, champagne-soaked caverns. This was the city of the flapper, whose skirt hems flirted with her knees and whose independence scandalized the old guard. It was the concrete battleground of the skyscraper wars, where the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building wrestled for the title of the world's tallest structure, symbolizing an ambition that reached to high, to fast. Prosperity had surged like a tidal wave after the Great War, making fortunes overnight, and New York was its glittering epicenter. The city's docks handled nearly half of America's international trade, and its factories churned out consumer goods for a newly affluent, credit-hooked middle class. Everything felt possible, everything felt permissible, and everything, inevitably, had a price. This intoxicating culture of consumption was directly facilitated by the great American experiment of prohibition. The 18th Amendment, intended to clean up the nation's morals, instead drove vice underground and transformed ordinary business into criminal enterprise. Alcohol flowed freely, but the profits were redirected from saloon keepers to bootleggers, racketeers, and an ever-growing network of organized crime. To survive and often to thrive in this New York, one needed two things: money and connections. And nowhere were those connections more vital than in the powerful, intricate, and deeply venal world of politics. The unofficial government of New York was Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that had perfected the art of graft, influence peddling, and patronage. Tammany was not merely a political organization. It was a parallel infrastructure that controlled everything from fire permits to judicial appointments. Its power rested on a symbiotic relationship between the masses and the elites. To the city's vast immigrant population, Tammany provided coal, jobs, and a holiday turkey. In return, it demanded absolute loyalty at the ballot box. To the city's high rollers, the developers, the theater moguls, the financiers, Tammany offered smooth sailing through the bureaucratic ocean and protection from pesky regulations. For a fee, of course, for those on the inside, like the recently appointed Judge Joseph Falls Crater. Tammany was the only ladder to the top. The year 1930, however, saw the first cracks appearing in this seamless facade. The stock market had collapsed, plunging the common man into soup lines. But it had also initiated a long overdue public skepticism of the wealthy and powerful. The mayor of New York, Jimmy Walker, a dapper, witty man who perfectly personified the Jazz Age, was being scrutinized as never before. Walker was a creature of Tammany, a man who seemed to treat the mayoralty as a platform for his musical comedy talents, rarely seen at his desk before noon, and whose personal finances were as hazy as the smoke in a backroom card game. The pressure cooker was building. A corruption inquiry, sponsored by a reform-minded governor named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the sources of wealth. Among New York's magistrates, the inquiry was a flickering candle against the gale force of Tammany's power, but it was a candle nonetheless. The people were growing tired of the champagne and vice lifestyle of their leaders. When their own cupboards were bare, the moral accounting of the decade was finally beginning. This was the electric, dangerous, and contradictory world that Justice Joseph Falls Crater inhabited. He was a man utterly of this time and place, sharp, ambitious, and politically connected. A judge who enjoyed the company of theatrical women and the favors of the political bosses. His apartment on Fifth Avenue placed him in the respectable heart of Greenwich Village. But his true home was the shadowy nexus where the city's high society, its criminal underworld, and its political machine intersected. This was the theater district around Broadway, known then as the Tenderloin or the Main Stem. a neighborhood of dazzling marquees and dark alleys, of legitimate theaters rubbing shoulders with speakeasies and gambling dens. Crater S. life was a perfect reflection of the city's dual nature. A respectable jurist by day, a connoisseur of the illicit by night, his rise had been swift, fueled by the machine's patronage and, allegedly, by enormous payoffs. The rumors swirled around him long before he disappeared, tales of lucrative receiverships, hand it down for a cut, whispered deals in the back rooms of Tammany's clubhouses, and a preference for young, ambitious showgirls over his society wife. The date was August 6, 1930. The market was still in the doldrums, the corruption inquiry was gathering steam, and the city was struggling to maintain its facade of gaiety. Amidst the growing dread of the Depression, the temperature was high, the mood was tense, and the forces that ruled Manhattan greed, power, and secrets were about to collide in a single, inexplicable moment. The city had seen spectacular crimes and scandals before, but it had never seen anything like the vanishing act of Judge Joseph Crater. He was about to step out of the blinding spotlight of the Roaring Twenties, leaving behind a hole that would consume the city's attention and epitomize its hidden decay. For decades to come, his disappearance would not just be a cold case, it would be a symbolic epitaph for a magnificent and doomed era. Joseph Force Crater was, by 1930, the quintessential Tammany success story, a man whose trajectory was proof that in New York, a sharp mind coupled with the right endorsements could elevate one from professional obscurity to judicial splendor almost overnight. His path, however, began far from the velvet ropes of Manhattan's elite circles, starting instead in the disciplined, tradition-bound world of academia. Born in 1889, Crater possessed an undeniable intellectual acumen. Graduating from Lafayette College and receiving his law degree from Columbia Law School in 1912, he was educated for the law, but destined for the game of politics. As a young lawyer, he didn't immediately set the legal world on fire. He was known for his sharp appearance, fastidious dress, and a keen, observational intellect, but he lacked the fiery oratory of a courtroom star. Instead, he possessed the more valuable skills for the age: discretion, loyalty, and an understanding of where the true power lay. His legal practice was respectable, focusing on corporate and real estate matters, but his attention was increasingly diverted to the intricate, backroom machinations of the democratic political machine. He became a fixture in the local Tammany clubs, where favors were exchanged for votes and ambitious young men were groomed for public life. Crater's political patron was a powerful figure named Thomas Silent Tom Foley, a Tammany district leader who controlled the levers of power in the 6th Assembly District. Foley saw in Crater the ideal protege, educated enough to be presentable, ambitious enough to be tireless, and transactional enough to understand the unspoken rules of the game. Foley secured Crater a series of modest but crucial appointments. These were not mere jobs, they were stepping stones, opportunities to demonstrate competence and, more crucially, loyalty to the machine's financial interests. The reward for this service arrived in April 1930. Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt, under pressure to make an uncontroversial appointment to the New York Supreme Court, reluctantly nominated Crater to fill a vacancy. Though Crater was relatively unknown to the public, he was the machine's choice. Meticulously vetted and strongly advocated by the Tammany leadership, the position was highly coveted, not just for its prestige, but for its virtually limitless opportunities for graft. A Supreme Court judgeship offered the power to appoint receivers for insolvent companies, settle large estates, and generally dispense favors, all of which could be discreetly monetized in the Tammany system. For the machine, Crater was not just a judge, he was an investment. With his appointment, Judge Crater formally ascended into the glittering, dangerous life of Manhattan's high society. His personal style was refined. He wore custom-tailored suits, carried a gold-tipped walking stick, and became a connoisseur of the city's finest, albeit illicit, nightlife. The press called him handsome and urbane, and he cultivated an air of intellectual gravity when necessary. Yet, his life was now defined by a powerful dichotomy: the sober gravity of the black judicial robe-on, the bench versus the moral looseness of the city after midnight. His marriage, too, reflected this duality. He had married Stella Mance Wheeler, a former vaudeville actress with a sharp wit and a taste for the theatrical. Stella provided Crater with the necessary social ballast, a wife with flair, who could navigate the complex social terrain of the upper class. But by 1930, the marriage had become strained, characterized by long separations and mutual suspicion. Crater found his primary comfort not at his respectable Fifth Avenue apartment, but in the fast-paced, uninhibited world of Broadway. Crater was a dedicated man about town, a constant fixture on Broadway's main stem. The nexus of legitimate theater, speakeasies, and the burgeoning motion picture industry. He often dined at notorious establishments, always seeking the company of actresses and chorus girls. This was not merely recreation, it was strategic networking. Broadway was deeply intertwined with the underworld. Many clubs were backed by racketeers like Arnold Rothstein or Dutch Schultz, and the financial deals of the entertainment industry often involved the same shadowy figures making fortunes off prohibition. Crater, the judge, was valuable to these interests. He was perceived as a man who could fix things, whether a minor zoning violation, a messy divorce for a theater owner, or a more serious legal entanglement for a gangster. His power was not in his legal knowledge, but in the access he provided to the corridors of justice. He accepted this role willingly, trading his reputation for influence and, critically, for money. The financial aspect of Crater's rise was the most troubling and, ultimately, the most critical to his fate. The judicial post paid a respectable salary of $25,000, equivalent to over $500,000 today, but Crater was spending far more. He had a penchant for expensive gifts for his female companions, tailored suits, and a gambling habit. His wealth, everyone knew, came from side income, specifically from Tammany-sanctioned payoffs, and as the summer of 1930 wore on, with a corruption probe looming and his name whispered in connection with shady deals, the pressure on Judge Joseph Crater was mounting. The respectable life he had so carefully constructed was balanced on a razor's edge, about to be consumed by the very world that had created him. What happened next would become one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this glimpse into the past, be sure to subscribe for more. One of the juiciest accusations against Judge Joseph Crater involved something called judicial receiverships. Now, when a company went belly up back then, a judge would appoint a lawyer as a receiver to manage and sell off its assets. This receiver got a nice fee, often 5% of everything. The rumor was that Crater, in exchange for some serious kickbacks, was appointing lawyers handpicked by Tammany Hall, the city's corrupt political machine. This kept a steady stream of shady money flowing into Tammany's pockets, and of course, into Crater's. He'd only been a judge for months, but he was already neck-deep in this system. By the summer of 1930, Crater's lavish lifestyle had spun a messy web of financial debts, political favors, and secret relationships. He was the man of the hour, a celebrated figure in the city, but the ground beneath him was starting to crack. A big corruption investigation, led by the governor, was starting to sniff around the judiciary. Tammany Hall was still powerful, but they were feeling the heat. A guy like Crater, who knew exactly where the money was buried, was both a huge asset and a terrifying liability. He was at the peak of his career a respected Supreme Court justice, a social elite, a man who knew the city's darkest secrets. But his success came from a deal with the devil, and as the political climate soured, it was almost time for the devil to collect. Judge Crater wasn't just a symbol of the Roaring Twenties excess, he was a ticking time bomb, and the system that built him was about to light the fuse. The summer of 1930 wasn't a relaxing vacation for Judge Crater. It was a frantic, secret mission to save his own skin. As July turned into August, his behavior got more and more erratic. He wasn't the carefree socialite anymore. He was a man bracing for a crisis. The storm clouds of a massive corruption inquiry, known as the Seabury investigations, were gathering, and Crater knew he was right in the path of the hurricane. He'd spent the early part of the summer with his wife, Stella, at their cabin in Maine, but this was less of a retreat and more of a tense, unhappy performance. Stella later said he seemed deeply troubled, always on the phone, often just staring into space, lost in thoughts he refused to share. Then, on July 25th, everything changed. Crater got a telegram. He never showed it to Stella, but it clearly agitated him. He immediately announced he had to go back to New York City for urgent judicial business. This was the real start of what we can call his summer of secrets. The idea of urgent business in August was suspicious from the start. The courts were mostly out for the summer, and the city's elite had fled the heat. Stella sensed something was wrong and stayed in Maine. This left Crater alone in New York, free to make his final, mysterious moves. His first priority wasn't called business, it was erasing his tracks. Over the next few days, he made several trips to his safe deposit box. This wasn't just to check on things. He pulled out a massive amount of cash somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000. That's over $100,000 in today's money. A staggering sum to just carry around. Was he paying someone off? Funding an escape? Settling a massive debt? This cash withdrawal is one of the biggest unsolved puzzles of the whole case. The secrecy continued at his office in the state Supreme Court building. On August 4th, he called his law clerk, Joseph Morrow, for a very unusual task. Help him clear out the huge, locked filing cabinets. Morrow said they were stuffed with documents, folders, and bundles of papers, likely all the records of his dirty political and judicial deals, including evidence of those shady receiverships. For hours, Crater and Morrow sorted through everything. The judge was specific. Some documents had to be destroyed immediately, but a select few, the really incriminating ones, were put into 2 large, sealed brown envelopes. He tied them with string and handed them to Morrow. "Hold these for me, Joe," he said, "and don't let anybody have them, not even Mrs. Doc Crater." This move strongly suggests he was preparing for a situation where he'd need leverage or where his papers might be seized. It was a calculated move to control his own story, even if he wasn't around. At the same time, the money kept rolling in. Crater got to big payments in the days before he vanished. A check for $500, and another for $4,000 that a witness claimed was for some kind of deal. All this cash, added to what he took from his safe deposit box, shows he was building a significant war chest. This wasn't just saving up, this was preparation. His social life continued, but it felt different, more frantic. He spent time with his regular companion, a young showgirl named Sally Lou Ritz. He took her out on the town, almost like a frantic farewell tour of his favorite Broadway spots. But behind the manic energy, he was clearly anxious. He was trying to figure out how much the corruption investigation knew, asking his Tammany buddies who was talking and what secrets were still safe. The secret maneuvers reached their peak on Tuesday, August 5th. Crater sent a telegram to his wife, Stella, telling her he'd be joining her in Maine sometime tomorrow or Thursday. This message was a clever misdirection, making it seem like he was heading north for a normal vacation, when he was actually still tangled in Manhattan's web of intrigue. Finally, Wednesday, August 6, 1930, arrived. It began with a tense, final feeling. Crater made one last phone call that we know of, a conversation that seemed to finalize his plans for the day. He gathered his cash, maybe a small travel bag. He had already officially filed papers to take a leave of absence, a formal step that signaled he planned to be gone for a while. The picture of Crater in his last weeks is crystal clear. This wasn't a man going on vacation. This was a man with a target on his back, making calculated moves to get cash, destroy evidence, and cut ties. Was he running from the law, paying off a blackmailer, or meeting a dangerous creditor? Any one of these is plausible. He had enough secrets, enough money, and enough enemies to make almost any outcome possible, setting the stage for his final, fateful step into the night. The morning of Wednesday, August 6, 1930, began with a deceptive quiet. For Judge Joseph Crater, this was the last day before he vanished from public life forever. He went to his chambers at the Supreme Court building for one final round of judicial business, which really just meant clearing his desk and signing off on his leave of absence. But the most important event of that morning wasn't the paperwork. It was a brief, intense, and totally mysterious phone call. Sometime before noon, Crater made a call from his office. Who was on the other end? That remains one of the great, frustrating mysteries of this case. Was it a Tammany boss giving a final order? A creditor demanding immediate payment? One of his many girlfriends arranging a last meeting? We'll probably never know for sure. What we do know comes from the people who saw him during and after that call. They noticed a huge shift in his mood. The call wasn't a casual chat. It carried the weight of a command. Witnesses said Crater, who was usually so smooth and collected, suddenly became rigid, gripping the phone receiver tightly. His answers were short, just 1 or 2 words, suggesting an urgency he couldn't hide. He wasn't arguing or negotiating. He seemed to be acknowledging a demand. People overheard fragments, like him giving an assurance or a confirmation, maybe agreeing on a time, a place, or an action. The whole atmosphere in the room changed. Whatever they were talking about was intensely private and potentially very dangerous. The call was short and to the point. When it ended, the judge looked visibly shaken. Immediately after hanging up, his actions sped up, becoming almost frantic, as if that call had set a timer he couldn't stop. He left his chambers not like a man heading off on vacation, but like someone with a critical, unchangeable deadline. That phone call was the trigger. The speculation about who called him is a perfect snapshot of that era. The most popular theory is the Tammany Ultimatum. The Seabury investigation was getting dangerously close, and Crater, who knew all about the judicial payoff system, was a major weak link. The call could have been the final order. Show up for a meeting to settle your accounts, or disappear for good. If he'd been caught cheating the machine or holding back money, that call could have been a death sentence. Another theory is the blackmailer's demand. Crater's wild lifestyle, the gambling. The affairs with showgirls made him a perfect target for blackmail. The call could have been from someone threatening to expose him, demanding one last huge payment to keep quiet. Thanks for watching, and if you're intrigued by history's greatest mysteries, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our channel where we dive deep into the most compelling unsolved mysteries in history. Today, we're unraveling the final, fateful hours of Judge Joseph Force Crater, a man who walked out of a restaurant in 1930 and vanished into thin air. What happened in those last days? It wasn't just a random disappearance, it was a meticulously planned operation, a process we can only call cleaning house. And it all started with a mysterious phone call. Picture this, it's a humid summer day in Manhattan. Judge Crater is in his chambers, a powerful man at the peak of his career. The phone rings. No one knows who was on the other end, but the impact was immediate and profound. According to his clerk, the judge's demeanor shifted. He was tense, his voice low. Whatever was said, it was an ultimatum. Some believe it was an underworld figure demanding a massive, final payoff for compromising information, perhaps about illicit political dealings or the judge's many romantic affairs. The tone suggested Crater had no choice but to comply. Others theorize it was a panic mistress needing a secret meeting and a large sum of cash to solve a problem. Whatever the content of that call, it acted as a catalyst. The moment he hung up, Crater walked over to his filing cabinets. He supervised his clerk, Joseph Mara, as they sealed 2 large brown envelopes filled with his most sensitive documents. He handed them to Morrow with a strict warning. This sequence is everything. The call triggers a protective measure. It tells us that Crater knew his personal safety, or at least his public life, was in imminent danger. He was preparing for a scenario where he couldn't retrieve those documents himself, but he needed them kept safe from everyone else. The call also likely dictated his next moves. He grabbed his hat, coat, and a small bag. He wasn't just leaving the office for the day. He was preparing for a journey. Was it a short trip to a secret meeting, or a long-haul escape out of the country? Only the caller knew. When he left his chambers around 12:30 p.m., he didn't say goodbye like a man going on vacation. He simply said, "I'm going out." The last glimpse his staff had was of a man walking quickly, nervously, into the Manhattan afternoon. That single phone call set his final course. It was the missing link, providing the motive for his secrecy and pointing toward the powerful forces that were now orchestrating his every move. Judge Crater's actions weren't the scattered movements of a man running from danger. They were the disciplined, calculated steps of someone preparing for either an extended exile or a lethal confrontation. This cleaning house operation had 2 critical parts: gathering a massive amount of cash and surgically removing his most incriminating papers. Let's start with the money. Upon his rushed return to New York from a trip to Maine, Crater made multiple visits to his safe deposit box. He withdrew a huge sum of cash, estimated to be over $5,000. In 1930, that was a fortune enough to buy a house or live comfortably for years. This wasn't vacation spending money. Converting assets into untraceable cash signals one thing. He needed money that left no paper trail for immediate, undisclosed purposes. So, why the cash? The most persuasive theory is a payoff. Crater's career was built on the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine, and its debts were often settled in cash. If he had betrayed a trust or mismanaged funds, this money might have been the price of his life. Another theory is that this was his escape fund. Crater had connections in places like Havana, Cuba, popular spots for those fleeing American justice. If that phone call was an order to disappear to avoid testifying against his Tammany patrons, this cash was his ticket to a new identity. A darker possibility is that the cash was bait. He might have hoped to negotiate a better outcome at his final meeting, to literally buy his life back from his enemies. Whatever the reason, this giant cash fund shows he was preparing to operate completely outside the law. The second part of his cleaning house operation was just as crucial: the destruction and preservation of documents. Back in his Supreme Court chambers, his clerk, Joseph Mara, watched as the judge went through two large steel filing cabinets, stuffed with the evidence of a career built on political favors. Crater gave specific, chilling instructions. Some documents were to be burned immediately, presumably records of corruption that weren't essential for his own leverage. But the most critical papers were separated and placed into those two sealed brown envelopes. What was in them? We can only speculate, but they were almost certainly the smoking guns. They could have been records of kickbacks, naming the officials who received their cut Tammany Hall's darkest secrets. Or they could have been evidence he was using against a blackmailer. Maybe they even contained his escape plan, with contact names and rendezvous points. When Crater handed these envelopes to his clerk, his warning was absolute. Don't let anybody have these, Joe, not even Mrs. Crater. This is incredibly telling. He trusted his clerk more than his own wife. It proves he anticipated that the police, investigators, or even his family would come looking for these papers. So, why keep them? If he was murdered, the documents could be his posthumous revenge, exposing the very machine that sacrificed him. If he fled, they were his insurance policy, the leverage he could use to negotiate a safe return someday. By cleaning out his office, Crater was severing his ties to the system, erasing his paper trail from the most vulnerable location. The mysterious phone call didn't start this plan, it just hit the fast-forward button. The evening of Wednesday, August 6, 1930, was the final act. After the cryptic call and securing his cash and documents, Judge Crater shifted from preparation to public performance. His destination for his final meal was Billy Hoss's Chop House, a classic New York steakhouse known for its discretion. It was a popular spot for politicians, Broadway figures, and the underworld players who funded both the perfect place for a high-stakes, unobserved conversation. He wasn't alone. His dinner companions were a showgirl named Sally Lou Ritz and a lawyer, William Fallon, who had deep ties to the Tammany machine. Sally Lou provided the perfect cover, making it look like a social dinner. Fallon, a trusted legal insider, likely represented the political side of the meeting. The atmosphere was reportedly cheerful on the surface, but witnesses noted a definite tension. Crater and Fallon were seen huddled together, speaking in low tones, their eyes scanning the room. It's highly probable they were discussing the looming Seabury investigation, a massive probe into judicial corruption that threatened to bring down the entire Tammany Empire. They were likely talking about who might be forced to testify and, most critically, the status of those two sealed envelopes Crater had entrusted to his clerk just hours before. The dinner was a final accounting of risks and plans. Around 9:15 p.m., Crater, Fallon, and Ritz left the restaurant. On the sidewalk outside, the judge hailed a taxi. He smiled, tipped his hat, and said goodnight to his companions. He told them he was heading off to see a show. The taxi pulled away, turned the corner, and drove into the glittering lights of Broadway. And just like that, Judge Joseph Force Crater was gone. He was never seen or heard from again. The taxi, the driver, the destination all remain a mystery. Did he go to a show? Was he instead taken to a secret meeting with his enemies? Or did that taxi simply drive him to a pier where a boat was waiting to take him to a new life in exile? The meticulous cleaning house operation is the strongest evidence we have that his disappearance wasn't an accident. It was the final, tragic fulfillment of a plan set in motion by the dark forces that ruled Manhattan. The cash, the documents, and the final tense dinner all point to a man who knew his time was up. One way or another, he was facing an existential threat from the very powers that had made him. The political debt was due, and Judge Crater knew that the price would be everything he had or his very life. And so, the mystery endures, a locked door to which we may never find the key. What do you think happened to Judge Crater? Was he silenced by the mob, or did he orchestrate the perfect escape? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into history's greatest unsolved cases. We'll see you next time. Have you ever heard of the man who just walked off the face of the earth? I'm not talking about a myth or a legend. I'm talking about a powerful, handsome New York Supreme Court justice who, one summer night in 1930, vanished into thin air. This is the story of Judge Joseph Force Crater, the missingest man in New York. Our story begins on the evening of August 6, 1930. Judge Crater was making his last public appearance, a carefully staged performance to project an image of complete normalcy. He was seen, he was heard, and he was surrounded by friends. This public display would later become a maddening distraction for investigators, creating a false trail of a man simply enjoying a night out, not a man being marched toward his doom. The dinner at Billy Hoss's Chop House on West 45th Street ended around 9:30 p.m. The judge paid the check, an act witnessed by the waiter Augustus Froelich, who would become one of the most cited, yet most unhelpful, witnesses in the case. The trio Crater, his lawyer friend William Fallon, and his showgirl mistress, Sally Lou Ritz, then left the restaurant and walked a short distance down the street. It was on this dark, bustling sidewalk that the official record of Judge Crater's life comes to a dead end. At the corner of 49th Street, near the Palace Theater, the party separated. Crater shook hands with Fallon and Ritz. Their goodbyes were described as brief, not lingering. The judge then turned and began to walk west on 49th Street, heading toward Broadway. This final, unobserved walk into the night is the moment he vanished, the exact point where history gives way to hypothesis. So, what happened to him? There are three main theories. Hypothesis 1, the prearranged meeting. This is the most compelling theory. It suggests that Crater was walking to a secret rendezvous, likely set up by a mysterious phone call he received earlier that day. He was heading straight into the heart of his secret life, the hotels, speakeasies, and back offices off Broadway where the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine and the mob conducted their business. He may have been carrying the cash he'd withdrawn, expecting to meet a blackmailer, a debt collector, or an emissary from Tammany. This meeting was meant to either settle his accounts or to transfer him into the custody of those. Who would ensure his disappearance? Hypothesis 2, voluntary exile. Perhaps Crater's final goodbye was literal. He might have walked to a waiting car ready to whisk him to a ferry, a train, or a dock where a ship waited to take him to Cuba or Mexico. The small, packed bag he'd taken from his office supports this idea. He could have been escaping a massive corruption inquiry before he could be forced to testify and destroy his former colleagues, buying his freedom with his fortune and his silence. And hypothesis 3, the ambush. Given the powerful interests Crater knew about mobsters, corrupt politicians, a whole system of judicial graft, the simplest explanation is often the most violent. He may have been intercepted just steps from the restaurant, hustled into an unmarked car, and silenced permanently. This theory is supported by a chilling fact. Crater's intimate secrets could have toppled the entire city government. In the world of Tammany Hall and Prohibition, a threat like that was neutralized with finality. The subsequent investigation proved only one thing: the city's incredible ability to conceal its own sins. Despite massive public attention and frantic search efforts, not a single piece of credible evidence, no body, no clothing, no trace of the cash was ever recovered. The powerful judge simply dematerialized into the urban sprawl. He was swallowed by the very machine that had created him, a spectacular casualty of the Roaring Twenties' corrupted heart. The strangest part? Judge Crater vanished on August 6th, but for nearly 3 weeks, nobody even noticed he was gone. His wife, the press, the entire city remained completely unaware. The initial silence was perfectly maintained. The judge had formally requested a leave of absence, suggesting a planned trip. He even sent a telegram to his wife, Stella, in Maine, saying he would join her sometime tomorrow or Thursday. This message, whether intentional or not, was the perfect alibi. Stella, used to her husband's erratic hours and long, unexplained absences, just assumed he was delayed by business, or was with a mistress before heading north. Her first flicker of concern came when Thursday passed without his arrival. When a whole week went by, her anxiety grew into suspicion, but she was hesitant to cause a scandal. A public search for a Supreme Court justice who might just be having an affair could destroy his career and hers. The tragic irony is that the secrecy she used to protect his reputation ended up protecting the mystery of his disappearance. Back in New York, the silence was just as profound. The courts were in recess, so his absence from the bench went unnoticed. The only people who knew he'd left his law clerk, and his dining companions had powerful reasons to stay quiet. His clerk was loyal. His friends, given their own shady connections, had every reason to distance themselves from a potentially dead or fleeing judge. Days bled into weeks. Stella's calls to their Fifth Avenue apartment went unanswered. It wasn't until August 25th, almost 3 weeks after the dinner, that the silence was finally broken. The trigger wasn't family concern, it was politics. The Democratic Judicial Nominating Convention was scheduled, and Judge Crater, as a sitting justice, was expected to attend. His absence from this critical political event, a mandatory act of loyalty to the Tammany machine, was immediately noticed. This was the moment the machine, which had been hiding the problem, was forced to confront it publicly. They tried a quick cover-up, vaguely citing illness or a prolonged vacation, but it was too late. Stella Crater, now desperate and furious, was on a train to New York. On August 26th, she arrived, found the empty apartment, and did what she should have done weeks earlier. She called the police. The news exploded on August 27th, 1930. The headline wasn't just judge missing, it was Supreme Court justice vanishes. The story was a bombshell. A wealthy, powerful, handsome judge, known for his love of chorus girls and his ties to a corrupt political machine, had literally walked off the face of the earth. The press instantly dubbed him the missingest man in New York. The realization that Crater was gone triggered panic in Tammany Hall. They knew an investigation into their missing judge would expose the system of judicial kickbacks and graft that funded their entire operation. The search for the judge quickly became a desperate, two-pronged effort. First, the official police search, a public, high-profile investigation whose real purpose, many believed, was to control the narrative and protect the Democratic Party. And second, the Tammany internal search, a secret effort to find a judge first, to ensure his silence if he was alive, or to dispose of any evidence if he was dead. The city was gripped by frenzy. The case became a global sensation. Every waitress, cab driver, and chorus girl had a theory. The investigation was plagued by deliberate opacity and red herrings. Witnesses were evasive. Political figures feigned shock. The 3-week delay had guaranteed the case would go cold. The discovery that his safe deposit box had been emptied and his court documents removed only amplified the sense of a massive, coordinated conspiracy. The moment the city noticed the judge was gone, his absence became a mirror, reflecting the rampant corruption and moral decay that lay beneath the glittering facade of the Roaring Twenties. So when the NYPD finally launched its formal investigation, it was already dead on arrival. The search was plagued by two fatal flaws: that critical 3-week delay, and the unspoken suspicion that the entire effort was being deliberately undermined by the very political forces who appointed the judge in the first place. The initial response from the authorities was one of calculated nonchalance. Mayor Jimmy Walker and the NYPD commissioner, both deeply entrenched in Tammany Hall, downplayed the crisis, suggesting the judge was just on vacation. This was meant to shield the machine from scrutiny. The investigation itself felt suspiciously constrained. The two key witnesses, Sally Lou Ritz and William Fallon, were interviewed. but their testimony was accepted with remarkably little challenge. The judge's apartment was searched, but only cursorily. The investigation into his Supreme Court office was even more delicate. Police were initially barred from a thorough search. When they finally got in, the filing cabinets had been emptied, confirming his cleaning house efforts. His law clerk admitted to having sealed envelopes from the judge, but refused to surrender them, and the NYPD, under political pressure, didn't push the issue, allowing the most important physical evidence to remain private. This is the clearest sign of political sabotage. The police knew those papers held the key to the Tammany graft system, and their contents were considered more dangerous than the judge's disappearance itself. As public outcry grew, the police put on a more theatrical effort. They issued thousands of posters with Crater's iconic image, making it one of the first viral missing person posters in American history. But the tips were a flood of false sightings. He was seen in Havana, in Atlantic City, even working as a lumberjack. None of it led anywhere. The police consistently focused on the idea that Crater was hiding because of personal financial issues or an affair, studiously ignoring the more explosive implications of political corruption. The entire search was a damage control operation. Tammany Hall figured a spectacular, fast-moving search would only draw more attention. By presenting a confused, slow-moving investigation that pointed toward voluntary flight, they created a diversion. The ultimate failure of the NYPD inquiry was its unwillingness to follow the money and the paper trail. They knew about the cash and the removed documents, yet they failed to trace the source of his wealth or force the disclosure of those envelopes. The investigation became a spectacle of incompetence, ensuring that the fate of Judge Joseph Crater, a man who knew too much, would remain forever submerged beneath the surface of New York's deepest secrets. Thanks for watching. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries from history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. See you next time. New York City, August 6, 1930. A dapper, confident man steps out of a popular steakhouse and into the bustling theater district. He waves goodbye to his dinner companions, turns a corner, and vanishes. He wasn't just any man. He was New York Supreme Court Justice Joseph Crater, and he was about to become the most famous missing person in American history. What happened to Judge Crater? Was he the victim of a brutal mob hit, a political assassination, or did he simply walk away from it all, executing the perfect escape? To understand the disappearance, you have to understand the man. Judge Crater was a product of his time, the Roaring Twenties. His official salary was a respectable $25,000 a year, but his lifestyle was that of a millionaire. He wore tailored suits, lavished expensive gifts on a string of showgirl companions, and gambled heavily. This extravagant living was bankrolled by a dirty secret: his deep involvement with Tammany Hall, the corrupt political machine that ran New York City. Though he'd only been a judge for a few months, Crater had allegedly pocketed tens of thousands in kickbacks. Tammany's real power was in real estate, and judges had immense control over zoning and property disputes. It's believed Crater fast-tracked rulings for developers connected to the machine, in exchange for huge, discreet cash payments. Rumors even swirled that he managed to black box fund a secret pool of illicit cash, used to buy votes and pay off officials. Crater didn't just know where some of the bodies were buried. He knew the entire financial blueprint of the city's corruption. He was a walking, talking threat to the entire political establishment. The ground began to shake in the summer of 1930. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt had launched the Seabury investigation to root out corruption in the city's courts. The investigation was alarmingly effective, and its focus was climbing the ladder, heading straight for Supreme Court justices like Crater. Tammany Hall bosses knew Crater with his taste for risk and questionable stability. Was their weakest link? If he was called to testify, he might crack under pressure and bring the whole house of cards down. They faced a terrible choice: let Crater talk and watch the machine crumble, or eliminate the problem. Just before he vanished, Crater was on vacation in Maine with his wife. He received a mysterious phone call that sent him rushing back to the city. Once there, he began a frantic house cleaning. He withdrew huge sums of cash, the equivalent of over $100,000 today, and spent hours in his office destroying documents. Was he preparing to flee? Or was he being lured to a final, fatal meeting to settle his accounts? The police investigation, controlled by the Tammany-appointed mayor, was strangely passive. They never aggressively pursued crucial evidence, like the sealed envelopes Crater left behind. It was less of a search and more of a cover-up. The system wasn't looking for a missing man. It was guarding its own dark secrets. Caught in the middle of this storm was his wife, Stella Crater. Their marriage was one of convenience. A former actress, she gave the judge social respectability, while he provided financial security. They often lived apart, so when he didn't show up for their planned vacation reunion, she wasn't immediately alarmed. She was used to his erratic schedule and his affairs. But as days stretched into weeks, annoyance turned to dread. She hesitated to go to the police. Reporting a Supreme Court justice missing would unleash a media frenzy, especially if he just turned up after a secret rendezvous. Finally, after 3 weeks, she went to the authorities and offered a $5,000 reward, turning the case into a national sensation. But her testimony was full of contradictions. She claimed to know nothing about his massive cash withdrawals or his illicit income. She downplayed his many affairs as simple flirtations. Her story painted a picture of a husband simply heading off for a quiet vacation, a narrative that clashed violently with the evidence of a man frantically erasing his tracks. Her story seemed designed to protect his image or perhaps conceal secrets she couldn't reveal. Years later, a new mystery emerged around those sealed envelopes Crater had left behind. After a long legal battle, Stella won possession of them. Everyone believed they held the key to his disappearance, but in a move that stunned the public, she refused to reveal their contents, claiming they were too personal. Why would she hide evidence that could potentially solve the mystery of her husband's fate? This refusal led many to believe the papers contained truths she found more threatening than the mystery itself, truths about his corruption, or maybe even her own complicity. Stella was left to navigate the public spectacle, forever cast as either the tragic, betrayed wife or the woman who knew far more than she ever let on. With the official investigation stalled, the public's imagination ran wild, creating a mosaic of incredible theories. These theories generally fall into two camps: he was murdered or he ran away. The murder theory remains the most likely. It posits that Crater was silenced to stop him from talking. The suspects. First, the Tammany Hall bosses. His disappearance was a political necessity, carried out by the machine's enforcers to ensure their own survival. Second, organized crime figures. The worlds of graft and the mob were intertwined. Crater might have double-crossed a powerful racketeer, a mistake that, in the world of prohibition, was met with swift and final punishment. The scenario is chillingly simple. Crater left the restaurant and was lured into a waiting car or a nearby apartment for a meeting. Once inside, he was killed. His body was then disposed of where it would never be found, buried in one of the city's countless construction sites or dumped into the Atlantic. This theory holds up because only a powerful organization like Tammany Hall or the mob could make a man of Crater's stature vanish so cleanly from the heart of Manhattan. But what if he wasn't a victim? The voluntary disappearance theory paints Crater as a master of his own destiny, facing professional ruin, disbarment, and jail time. Starting a new life somewhere else was an attractive option. His massive cash withdrawal and the small bag he was carrying suggest he was planning a long trip. In this scenario, he simply walked away, used his connections and cash to secure passage to a place like Cuba or Mexico, and started over. The main problem with this theory is the silence. It is hard to believe a man with Crater's ego could live out his days in quiet anonymity, never once reaching out or being spotted. Over the decades, tantalizing, unverified clues have surfaced. In the 1950s, a woman claimed her dying husband confessed to killing Crater with 2 other men and burying his body under a new housing project in the Bronx. Searches found nothing. Later, a woman claiming to be Crater's mistress produced a note, allegedly from the judge, warning her he was in danger and that she would never see me again. This suggests Crater knew he was walking into a trap. Ultimately, Judge Crater was a sacrificial lamb. He played the brutal game of corruption in Roaring Twenties New York, and when the stakes got too high, The system he served simply consumed him. His disappearance wasn't just a crime story, it was a political assassination. He walked out of that steakhouse and into the dark maw of the very machine that had made him a judge. His case became a terrifying lesson in Tammany's New York. Corruption wasn't just a vice. It was a systemic, deadly force. The missing judge became the ghost of the city's guilt, a permanent reminder that beneath the glittering surface of Manhattan, there was a darkness that could swallow a manhole. Thanks for watching. If you found this mystery as fascinating as I do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest unsolved cases. See you next time, when a man as prominent as New York Supreme Court Judge Joseph Crater vanishes without a trace. The official investigation might fail, but that's when the legend begins. For decades after he stepped into a taxi on a warm August night in 1930, the search for the missingest man in New York became a national obsession. It wasn't just a police inquiry, it was a permanent, open-source folk mystery, fueled by sensational headlines, desperate hopes, and the public's eagerness to believe even the most outlandish theories. The Crater case became a cultural touchstone. It generated a persistent trail of unverified sightings, dramatic confessions, and even the involvement of psychic detectives. A $5,000 reward offered by his wife, Stella Crater, coupled with the judge's highly recognizable face plastered across the country, guaranteed a flood of sightings. Crater became a ghost, seemingly everywhere and nowhere at once, his image imprinted on the American consciousness. Early reports placed him in Florida, supposedly recovering from a nervous breakdown under an assumed name. Others claimed he was living it up in Havana, Cuba, a well-known haven for American fugitives escaping prohibition. These stories painted a picture of a man enjoying a life of luxury, paid for with the illicit cash he'd withdrawn right before he disappeared. Then there were the more colorful claims, suggesting Crater had swapped his custom suits for rugged work clothes. He was reportedly spotted working as a lumberjack in the Canadian wilderness, a dishwasher in an Oklahoma diner, and even managing a ranch out in the Pacific Northwest. These sightings appealed to a romantic idea of the high-flying city man, seeking redemption through hard labor, a narrative that resonated deeply during the Great Depression. Even years later, people swore they saw him back in New York. Waiters claimed he'd dined in their restaurants, clerks said he'd bought cigars in their shops. Each sighting was quickly debunked, but they all served a purpose, keeping the mystery alive in the city where it all began. The sheer volume of these claims highlighted a critical point. The public, tired of corruption and economic despair, wanted the judge to have succeeded. It was far easier to believe he had pulled off the ultimate disappearing act than to accept the chilling alternative that he had been brutally silenced by the untouchable powers of Tammany Hall. Perhaps the most dramatic and frustrating part of the enduring legend were the multiple deathbed confessions that surfaced over the years. These stories, often emerging decades later, offered tantalizing, though unprovable, narratives of Crater's final moments. They gave a voice to the underworld whispers that had surrounded the case from the very beginning. The most detailed and lasting claim came in 1950. A waitress named Stella Ferrucci Good claimed that her estranged husband, Frank, confessed on his deathbed that he and two other men had been hired to kill the judge. According to the story, Crater was bludgeoned to death in a Brooklyn house. What happened to the body? The confession offered two gruesome possibilities. It was either dissolved in quicklime or buried beneath the freshly poured concrete of a new housing project in the Bronx. This led to police digging at the Concourse Village site, but predictably, they found nothing. The confession was circumstantial, but it resonated with the mob execution theory. Later, in the 1970s, another claim emerged. A man who allegedly died in a western state left behind a letter pinpointing the location of Crater's remains on a piece of land in Staten Island. The site was searched, but like all the others, it yielded nothing but dirt and debris. These confessions, while never leading to a body, were powerful. They addressed the one question everyone was asking: what happened to the body? They seemed to confirm the public's darkest fears that Crater was a victim of mob violence, systematically executed and disposed of to protect a larger, more powerful conspiracy. These stories were like the underworld's unofficial delayed accounting of the price of playing the city's dirty political game. With no physical evidence to be found, the public imagination turned to the supernatural. The crater case became a magnet for psychics, mediums, and clairvoyants, each offering their own paranormal solution to the mystery. One widely publicized psychic claimed that Crater had been killed in a car accident, and his body was buried at a specific spot on Long Island. Another insisted the judge was alive and well, living as a hermit in the Canadian wilderness, protected by his guilt and the vast, cold landscape. The press eagerly reported these psychic clues, reflecting the era's fascination with the occult and the public's desperate need for any kind of closure. While these claims had zero investigative value, they were crucial in transforming Crater's disappearance from a simple crime into an ongoing, almost supernatural riddle. Ultimately, the missingest man in New York never stopped being seen, confessed about, or divined. The legends ensured his case would never truly be closed. The years following the disappearance of Judge Joseph Force Crater were defined by a paralyzing legal limbo. The man was gone, his judicial seat was empty, and his affairs were frozen, yet legally, he was still alive. Under common law, a person could only be presumed dead after an unexplained absence of 7 years. For nearly a decade, Crater existed as a judicial ghost, his absence a bureaucratic nightmare and a constant, mocking reminder of the secrets buried beneath New York society. The need for a legal resolution was twofold, personal and political. First, there was Stella Crater's financial crisis. The judge had left behind some assets, a modest estate, their Fifth Avenue apartment, but Stella couldn't touch them. She was left with the dubious fame of a great mystery and the crippling uncertainty of a widow in waiting. She needed a death certificate to settle the estate, claim any life insurance, and finally gain the freedom to move on. Second, there was a crucial political problem. Crater's seat on the New York Supreme Court, one of the most powerful judicial posts in the state, remained technically unfilled. Temporary appointments were made, but both the Tammany political machine and the growing reform movement desperately needed to confirm a permanent successor. The vacant seat was a political scar, a reminder of the corruption that had allowed the judge to rise and then to fall. As the 7-year mark approached in 1937, Stella Crater petitioned the courts to have her husband declared legally dead. The hearings were dramatic, forcing the courts to confront the unsolved mystery that had embarrassed the entire city. Stella's lawyers had to prove that every avenue of search had been exhausted, and that the circumstances of his disappearance pointed to death, not just a man who had decided to walk away. This was a tricky argument. Evidence like the cash withdrawal and the removal of documents strongly suggested a planned escape. Yet, her lawyers argued that the complete lack of credible contact in 7 years, combined with the ominous context of his political dealings, led to the inescapable conclusion that he had met a terrible end. The court reviewed the events of that fateful night in 1930 and the half-hearted police investigation that followed, which had been hobbled by political pressure. A key point of contention during the proceedings was the issue of the sealed envelopes the judge had left behind. By then, Stella had obtained the 2 packages, claiming they contained only a personal letter and minor documents. She refused to reveal their contents, and the court couldn't force her. This secrecy fueled public and legal doubt. Did the papers contain a suicide note, an alibi, or an explanation? Her refusal suggested the contents were too damaging personally or politically to ever see the light of day. On June 6, 1939, nearly 9 years after he vanished, the court finally ruled. Joseph Force Crater was declared legally dead. The official cause of death was listed simply as disappeared. The legend, however, was just getting started. The ghost of Judge Crater, always just around the corner or buried just beneath the surface, remained the city's most famous and frustrating resident. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the shadows of history. On June 6, 1937, almost 8 years after he was last seen, the New York State Supreme Court finally rendered its verdict. Judge Joseph Force Crater was declared legally dead. This ruling wasn't a victory for truth, it was a victory for administrative closure. It didn't solve the mystery, it just rubber-stamped the public's acceptance that he was gone for good. The legal finding allowed his wife, Stella, to take control of his estate. But after paying off debts and fees, it amounted to only about $2,000. This was a tiny fraction of the immense wealth the public imagined. The corrupt judge had stashed away. The verdict also officially cleared his Supreme Court seat, allowing a permanent replacement to be appointed. This finally erased the political stain of the Tammany Hall scandal from the court roster. In the end, the legal reckoning was an anticlimax. It marked the moment the government officially surrendered the case to history, legend, and speculation. Crater was no longer a missing person. He was a footnote in legal history, a name on a death certificate with no cause of death, no final location, and no justice. The city had closed the file, not with a solution, but with a sigh of legal resignation. This cemented the judge's place as an American political myth, the man who knew too much, and vanished into the permanent darkness of the Roaring Twenties. The legal declaration of death closed the court records, but it failed to satisfy the public's desperate hunger for the truth. For decades, the Crater case just lingered, kept alive only by false sightings and yearly press retrospectives. Then, nearly 2 decades after the judge's vanishing, a single, terrifying whisper from a dying man revived the case. It provided what many investigators would later call the most credible explanation for the judge's fate. This was the Quedlinburg Confession. The revelation emerged around 1950 in the form of a deathbed statement from Frank Quedlinburg, a maintenance worker and former taxi driver from the Bronx. As Frank faced his final moments, he confessed a terrible secret to his estranged wife, Stella Frucci Good. He told her he had participated in Judge Crater's murder and the disposal of his body. Stella, a waitress with no previous connection to the case, was reluctant to come forward, but the burden of the secret became too much to bear, and she eventually contacted the authorities. The story she told was horrific, yet chillingly specific. It finally provided the essential missing links, the motive, the method, and the burial location. According to Frank Quedlinburg's confession, the murder was an organized hit, orchestrated by the powerful forces of the Tammany Hall machine, and executed by low-level mob operatives. Crater wasn't killed because he double-crossed the mob. He was killed because he was about to be forced to testify before the Seabury Commission, and his knowledge of the judicial payoff system was simply too destructive to risk. The disappearance wasn't an escape, it was an execution designed to look like one. Here's how Quedlinburg said it happened. First, the luring. He claimed that Crater was lured from the chop house not by an enemy, but by a trusted associate. This explains that final phone call and the discussion with his friend William Fallon. Crater wasn't ambushed on the street. He was taken voluntarily to a private home in Brooklyn, believing he was attending a secret, emergency political meeting to settle his accounts and plan his temporary escape from the city. Second, the murder. Once inside the house, the judge was confronted by Quedlinburg and 2 other men, referred to only as Solly and Vinny, common names for mob enforcers of that era. Quedlinburg was explicit. Crater was killed with a blow to the head from a blunt object. This method was efficient and silent, consistent with a professional hit designed to avoid noise and blood. The swiftness of the act underscores the cold, calculating nature of the contract. The judge wasn't tortured or questioned, he was simply silenced. And third, the disposal. This was the most critical detail of the confession, the final resting place. Quedlinburg claimed that after the murder, the body was transported across the city to a newly developing area in the Bronx. At the time, huge sections of the Bronx were undergoing massive construction. Quedlinburg stated that Judge Crater was buried beneath the foundation of a large new housing complex, specifically identified as the Concourse Village development. The body was allegedly submerged in a pit and then covered with cement and tons of earth, ensuring a permanent, undetectable burial site sealed beneath solid concrete. The unsettling nature of this confession was its sheer plausibility. It accounted for every major question in the case: the cash he withdrew perhaps used to pay the hitman, the lack of a body, perfectly explained by the concrete foundation, the voluntary way he left the restaurant he was led not forced, and the political motive silencing a key witness. It fit the ruthless logic of the Tammany Mob Alliance. Spurred by the specific details of the claim, the police and federal authorities took the confession seriously. In the early 1960s, A limited investigation was conducted at the Concourse Village site, but they couldn't justify tearing down an entire apartment complex. They used ground-penetrating radar and took core samples to search the most likely areas. But decades of construction, new layers of concrete, and the immense size of the site made any discovery impossible. The body, if it was ever there, was sealed for eternity. The Quedlinburg Confession, though legally unproven, became the consensus truth for many serious crime historians. It transformed the romantic notion of Crater escaping to Mexico into the brutal reality of a political execution. This last clue offered a final, grim answer. Judge Crater did not disappear into the night. He was absorbed by the concrete and steel of the very city he helped corrupt. His death was the final price he paid for his ambition, a chilling testament to the fact that in the New York of the Roaring Twenties, some secrets were worth more dead than alive. The story of Judge Joseph Force Crater is not just the story of a man who vanished. It's the definitive narrative of an era's corruption, a textbook example of a perfect crime, and a chilling testament to the power of political forces to achieve absolute erasure. 95 years after he stepped off that Manhattan street, Crater remains the missingest man in New York, not because of a lack of clues, but because the conspiracy responsible for his disappearance was larger and more efficient than the law itself. The key to Crater's enduring status as the ultimate cold case lies in 4 insurmountable factors that converged on that August night in 1930: political complicity, operational efficiency, strategic silence, and symbolic resonance. First, political complicity. The system protected itself. Crater's disappearance wasn't the work of a lone criminal. It was a political emergency managed by the Tammany Hall machine. He vanished at the exact moment. The Seabury Commission was poised to expose corruption in the judiciary. The machine's goal was not to solve the crime, but to manage the scandal. The initial 3-week delay and the half-hearted search that followed were not accidents or incompetence. They were deliberate acts of political interference. The administration of Mayor Jimmy Walker and the NYPD, both deeply tied to Tammany, ensured that critical evidence like those sealed envelopes, the cash flow, and the political pressures were ignored, suppressed, or redirected. The clearest evidence of this complicity was the failure to aggressively pursue the sealed documents held by Crater's law clerk. Those papers were the key to the whole scheme. By letting Stella Crater get control of them and refuse disclosure, the authorities ensured the machine's secrets remained buried. Second, operational efficiency. The mob's perfect crime. The probable execution of Judge Crater was a testament to the brutal efficiency of organized crime. During Prohibition, operating with a political green light, the mob had mastered the art of making a body disappear, especially in a city undergoing massive construction. The method described in the confession: blunt force trauma and burial beneath a concrete foundation guaranteed absolute, permanent silence. In a city where foundations for skyscrapers were constantly being poured, the perfect burial site could be created and sealed within hours. Unlike many cold cases where some trace of the victim is found, the Crater case yielded nothing. No blood, no clothing, no body. The killers left no physical trail. It was a professional cleaning job, executed with lethal precision. Third, strategic silence. The conspiracy of fear. The survival of this mystery was ensured by widespread fear and loyalty among the key witnesses. The people who saw Crater last, his showgirl mistress, his lawyer friend, his clerk, all had strong reasons to downplay what they knew. Their lives and careers were intertwined with Tammany and the underworld. In 1930, silence regarding a powerful entity like the mob was not a choice. It was self-preservation. A single credible leak would have invited lethal retribution. The potential witnesses chose to endure public suspicion rather than risk their lives. Finally, symbolic resonance. The epitaph of the Jazz Age. The sheer symbolic power of Crater's vanishing ensured his status as a permanent legend. He was the ideal person to disappear. Handsome, powerful, corrupt, and a connoisseur of the illicit. He embodied the entire intoxicating, morally compromised spirit of the Roaring Twenties. His disappearance felt like a moment of divine reckoning for the whole era. For the average American struggling through the Great Depression, The unsolved case was a tangible symbol of a city where the rich and powerful literally got away with murder. The ultimate conclusion is that Judge Joseph Crater was not missing in the traditional sense. He was erased. The conspiracy that created him as a corrupt judge was the same one that saw him as a liability, and it performed his final administrative act. The cash was transferred, the documents were hidden, the political slate was cleaned, and the body was sealed beneath the relentless expansion of New York City. The search for the missingest man in New York has long since ended, but the question persists. The mystery of Judge Crater will forever stand as the single most perfect illustration of the truth. Beneath the glittering facade of the Roaring Twenties, that in New York anything could be bought, and some people were worth more dead and silenced than alive and talking. His name is an enduring American riddle, a ghost in a Brooks Brothers suit, haunting the foundations of the modern city he helped build, and which ultimately consumed him. Thanks for watching. If you're fascinated by mysteries like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video.